moment, letting some folks into the episode here. And just to let you know, we will be live streaming on YouTube. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for joining. Glad to see folks trickling in here. If you're here for the climate chats from AARP, you're in the right place. We'll just get started in just a few minutes. Okay, looks like we're at a good amount of folks that are in. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay, thank you everyone so much for joining. My name is David Azevedo. I'm with AARP California. I'm an Associate Director for Advocacy and Community Engagement. Thank you so much for joining our 5th episode of AARP Climate Chats. We have a really great program here for you today. Thanks for tuning in wherever you may be. Okay, so at AARP here, we work really hard and we're so glad to have you join us. But we're working really hard to deliver results for our over 3.3 million members in the Golden State, working on important quality of life issues in healthcare, retirement security, and age-friendly communities. Thank you again so much for joining us today for a critical conversation on how climate change is affecting older adults' health, wealth, and self. Our Climate Chats event series thus far has tackled air pollution, California's water crisis, composting and recycling, and how you can better prepare for extreme heat events. You can check out full-length versions of these episodes on our Climate Chats page, which you can locate by using the search term AARP Climate Chats in your internet search bar. On today's episode, we'll be having an in-depth conversation on plastics and their impact on our health and well-being. Plastic is something that's everywhere in our lives, from food containers, water bottles, and even our clothing. Plastics are a class of material that chemists call polymers, a type of molecule that is made of carbon. If the term carbon sounds familiar, that's because plastics are derived or made from carbon-based fossil fuels like oil. Plastics were completely transformative as a product when they were first introduced as a mainstream item in the post-World War II years. Containers and items that were made from metals and glass, which could be broken, were replaced by the far more durable plastic. This durability made plastics popular, especially in recent years. So popular that there is now an estimated 8.3 billion tons of plastic that currently exists in the world, the equivalent of 55 million jumbo jets. But this popularity and durability comes with a major problem, especially as we're learning now when it comes to human health. New research is showing that tiny particles of broken down plastic, called microplastics, are now being detected in human blood. Plastics have been found in fish as far away as Antarctica. One study estimated that people might be ingesting the mass of a credit card's worth of microplastic a year. Thankfully, a field of science is emerging to study the health effects of plastics. We're grateful today to have on our show 2 experts working in this area from very different areas that can educate us about what they're seeing and what steps we can take as individuals to decrease plastic use. With that, let me introduce my co-moderator for today's panel, AARP member and AARP volunteer, Bob Prath. Bob, would you like to say a few words to get us started?
Thanks, David, and good morning to all, and a very large thank you this morning to all of our panelists today. Much of my volunteer work with AARP relates to livable communities and a healthy, clean, pollutant-free environment that's key to maintaining livability in a community. Well, I've dealt with plastics and the microplastic pollution in the recently or the latter part of my life. I'm particularly concerned with learning more today about the possible health impacts on my grandchildren, who will spend their entire life dealing with this issue. So I'm really looking forward to learning from our panelists today, and thanks to all. Over to you, David.
Fantastic. So really excited to be introducing our two panelists here. So we'll introduce folks, our panelists, and then we'll have about 30 minutes to 40 minutes of a panel-led discussion with our two guests today, and then we'll have time for questions and answers at the last 15 minutes of this hour. So for those of you who may not be familiar, there's a chat feature on the Zoom that you can access just at the bottom of your screen, where you can click it and add your questions to the queue. We're more than happy to take questions as we're doing the panel, so please make sure to use that feature if you have those questions, and we'll get to them at the end of our panel discussion in about 30 to 40 minutes. So with that, let me introduce our panelists. First up is Dr. Scott Coffin. He's a research scientist and subject matter expert for microplastics at the California State Water Resources Control Board, where he leads the agency's efforts to monitor and manage microplastics pollution in drinking water and the environment. Dr. Coffin led international working groups to standardize analytical methods and develop risk-based thresholds for humans and aquatic ecosystems for microplastics. Dr. Coffin also serves as an editor for the Frontiers in Water Journal and co-chairs the Global Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry's Microplastics Interest Group's Planning Committee for an upcoming workshop. Dr. Coffin has been researching microplastics since 2014, starting with his graduate research in environmental toxicology at the University of California, Riverside. Welcome, Dr. Coffin. Also with us is Linda Escalante. She's a California Coastal Commissioner appointed by Assembly Speaker Anthony Rendon in 2019. She is also an ex officio member of the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy and works for the National Resources Defense Council as their Southern California Legislative Director. For over 2 decades, she has been working to protect our health and environment with a focus and understanding of social disparities and systemic inequities. Linda is a well-recognized environmental leader and expert in the US-based Spanish language media and has been bestowed several awards, including the Latina Magazine's New Generation Award. She is also passionate about civil, immigrant, and women's rights. She migrated to the US from Colombia as a child and lived as a dreamer until she went on to the University of California, Los Angeles, where she graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in Biology. Welcome, Linda. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started with our first question that Bob will be asking Dr. Coffin. Take it away, Bob.
Thanks, David. Dr. Coffin, can you get us started off by giving us a basic explanation of what microplastics are, kind of where they come from, and what role do single-use plastics play in generation of microplastics? And in fact, what are microplastics and what are single-use plastics? And where we're finding the particles.
So microplastics are plastic particles that can be ingested or inhaled. And in a regulatory sense, we consider plastic particles smaller than 5 millimeters to be considered microplastics. And you can see 5 millimeters with the naked eye, but the vast majority of microplastics that we're exposed to they require either a microscope or even more advanced technology to actually visualize these particles. They're very, very small, often smaller than the width of a red blood cell. And most of these plastic particles come from the materials that we use on a daily basis. Plastic is a fundamental building block of society. And if you look around your home, you're bound to see plastic just about everywhere. Carpets and rugs, often upholstery on furniture, our clothing, packaging that we receive from grocery stores and other aspects of our lives. All of these are potential sources of microplastics, and just having them around us and using them will generate very small amounts that can be inhaled, or they can fall into our food or our water, and we can accidentally ingest them. And the role of single-use plastics in the generation of microplastics is tremendous. It's estimated that more than half of the microplastics that we're exposed to are due to single-use plastics. And the reason for this is that a lot of single-use plastics are made to last a short amount of time. They're not made to be durable for a long period of time and not shed. We're also generating so much so much single-use plastics that they escape into the environment. And once they're under direct sunlight, they can rapidly break down into smaller and smaller particles, which can make their way into our water supplies through rivers and through rain and just wind. I guess we're finding these particles everywhere we look, from the deepest part of the ocean, the Mariana Trench, all the way to Mount Everest. We've found microplastics. Recently, we found microplastics in 11 out of 13 humans' lungs. We've also found them in human blood, feces, placenta, as well as the brains of mice, and virtually every organism that we've looked at out in the environment.
Wow, that is quite a bit. I mean, I'm so glad that we're here and we're having experts like yourself kind of walk us through all of this, because it is a lot to learn. So thank you so much for that. Our next question is to Linda. So Linda, you cover the issue area of microplastics for the Natural Resources Defense Council and your role with the California Coastal Commission. Can you share with us a big picture look at what is being done from a policy level on single-use plastics here in California, and how it's comparing with other parts of the country and the world?
Well, first, super grateful to you, David, and Shay and Bob and all of the AARP family for this opportunity to chat with you and alongside the great Dr. Coffin. So I'm grateful for this moment. And the issue of microplastics and plastic pollution really is another head of the hydra. I like to think that I've dedicated my career as an advocate to fight against. And it's an environmental problem where climate change and the issue of fossil fuels and public health, toxic chemicals, and environmental and labor justice issues intersect for me. And as you heard, I'm Colombian, so I like to quote the great Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who's said in the Chronicle of a Foretold Death. And this is not of a person, but really it's of a beautiful living future of our current and future generations. So I take this to heart. And as a coastal commissioner, I also took that oath very seriously to protect the public trust. And 80% of the plastic pollution that ends up in the coast and the oceans comes from our single-use trash from land, and I have also tried to see most of the California coast during this tenure. And there's not a single time that I don't walk out with my pockets and my hands full of plastic trash, like food containers and plastic bags. And, the commission endorses our state's Ocean Protection Council microplastics plans and really all other policy efforts to reduce the amount of plastic in our environment. So, it's a lot is happening on this issue. Luckily, I think the public really cares, and the public does. It's obvious. We see it on our streets. We see it everywhere. I don't think we can take 10 steps without running into a plastic mask on the floor. So I'll start off with what's hot off the presses. And most recently, our California State Attorney General Bob Bonta said a couple of days ago, very public way, that enough was enough, and he's leading the first and the only of its kind investigation actually in the world to make the petrochemical industrial complex accountable for yet another decades-long intentional misinformation campaign, which has been aimed to bamboozle the public into believing that this greenwashing theater of recycling that has really covered up the true cost of this endless flood of plastic products. So we appreciate the momentum that the state of California has right now. And I think it's one of the key things we need to take away from what the Attorney General is doing is why ExxonMobil, an oil company, is actually the target of their investigation. And I think it's key for our AARP family to understand that most plastics that end up as environmental pollutants actually derive from fossil fuels, like the products that ExxonMobil makes and sells with such great profit margins. So most plastic products also have kind of extra nasty additive toxic chemicals. to boot, such as endocrine disruptors or carcinogens, flame retardants, plasticizers. We remember the days when we had BPA in our kids' bottles. And plastics don't degrade, they don't disappear. As you heard Dr. Coffin, they just break down into microparticles that end up being by water, soil, air, snow, rain, everything, just ubiquitous ingredient in our Earth's food web, right? And ultimately, we're the top predator on the food web. And now we're finding that, we have on average consume a credit card's worth of microplastics each week. And our bodies, much like the turtles that we see on, National Geographic and the ocean and the plastic gyres, we are all non-consenting subjects, really, of global chemical experiments that, with concerning implications. And I think I'm glad that, our water board and our state is putting all the best minds in charge of finding out what this experiment is gonna come. But we already know that is having a catastrophic impact for our wild ecosystems. And it's terrifying, really, an unknown future for our own physical health. So we know that, these companies are the ones that, are behind the production of plastics, and companies like ExxonMobil are ramping up the output of plastics because they're concerned that because of climate change and the fact that people are wanting to move off their fuels, they're going to shift more and more of their efforts into expanding their plastic presence around the world. And that's very, very concerning, because we're trying to reduce our pollution and reduce our emission and not, make it much, much worse. And, there's an estimate that right now, petrochemicals, the category that includes plastics, account for 40% of our oil use and are expected to drive about half of oil demand growth between now and 2050. And I'm not making that up, that's from the International Energy Agency. So the World Economic Forum expects that plastic pollution will double in the next 20 years, which is quite significant. So I think we're going to get into the details of some of the legislation and some of the policy ideas. I'm one of the proponents of the plastics initiative that will be on the ballot in November, even though it was at the beginning of the pandemic and the unprecedented stay-home order. We were able to garner almost 1 million, over 900,000 signatures from Californians to make it qualifying on the ballot in November. And I'm happy to talk about some of those details that are, the idea is to have a comprehensive policy designed to really tackle the problem at the source and not allow for any more loopholes and any more, greenwashed solutions to clean up the act.
Okay. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Linda. Dr. Coffin, as a resource scientist with the state of California, you're directly involved with studying the effects of microplastics are having on our environment and personal health. For example, you're working to implement a series of laws looking to study the effects of microplastics in our drinking water and ecosystem impact. Can you share with us what you've been finding and responding to one of at least partially to one of the comments in the chat, how you measure for sure these things that exist in various parts of our body and our environment?
So in order to characterize risks to aquatic ecosystems and to humans, we have to first understand the hazards, so how much causes harm, and the exposure, how much is actually in the environment and how much are we being exposed to, and then compare those two. For aquatic ecosystems, we've been monitoring for microplastics for about a decade, and we've been doing toxicity studies in labs for about 20 years. We have over 167 studies looking at the health effects of microplastics in aquatic organisms, about 35 different species. And we have a fairly good idea about how much is potentially harmful to an aquatic ecosystem. We can compare the monitoring data and we can extrapolate what type of risks we would be expected to see if we continue making plastic at our current rates. And a recent risk assessment for the world's oceans found that a small percentage of ecosystems in the oceans are at risk, about 0.1%. But if we continue with business as usual, this is expected to exceed to about 2% of the world's oceans. And this is a very, very large amount of water. If you think about the world's oceans, it makes up a vast majority of our planet. And this is, when you think about the floating microplastics out in the marine environment, they're concentrated in certain locations, such as bays, closed water bodies, and the ocean gyres. So while there may be a little bit of risk happening out in the open ocean, there could be a significant amount of risk happening in a place like the San Francisco Bay or our harbors over on the East Coast, where there's very little dilution happening. The particles tend to aggregate and causing higher exposure. For human health, we've really only been studying the human health effects of microplastics as a scientific community for about 3 years. Before that, there was just a handful of studies that have looked really at occupational hazard exposure to workers in facilities. And in the past 3 years, we've conducted about 30 or so studies of the toxicity of microplastics on rodents. Rodents are typically a reliable surrogate for human health. And these studies are preliminary evidence. We don't have enough to say exactly how much is causing harm to humans, but what we can say based on the meta-analysis that my agency recently conducted is that microplastics exert effects on a wide variety of tissues through inflammation and oxidative stress. And those effect mechanisms can cause a variety of health outcomes. One of the apical endpoints that has been greatly studied in mammals is male reproduction. And we found that consistently these studies are demonstrating lower testosterone concentration, deformed sperm, lower sperm count, a lot of other impacts to male and female reproduction that potentially could impact the ability for humans and other organisms to have successful pregnancy outcomes. Again, we don't have enough confidence in these studies about what levels are actually causing this effect. And we also have limited exposure data. So it's not possible right now to know whether or not humans are actually at risk of microplastics for these particular effects. We also know that certain populations may be at higher risk based on their chronic diseases that they already have. Microplastics can exacerbate these diseases. One study looking in rodents that had acute ulcerative colitis, which is a disorder in the digestive tract that it causes higher amounts of contaminants to enter the body through the intestinal barrier. The study found that rodents that already had ulcerative colitis experienced greater inflammation and greater impacts to the liver than those that didn't with the same exposure concentration. So we really need to be focusing on the most sensitive populations when we perform these risk assessments and trying to protect those that are already at the margins, already have impacts from other environmental exposures.
Yeah, Dr. Coffin, really appreciate that. I know that was a lot to take in, and I know that this is a very difficult subject, especially to make that transition from the technical to to the to plain language here for all of us non-scientists. But you did a remarkable job at kind of giving us that. So thank you, and it just really made me think about how so far in our climate chats, this is our 5th episode. And Dr. Coffin, you mentioned, right, that we don't really know yet of the effects that it's having, but what we're really worried about as scientists is folks who already have pre-existing conditions, and that's something that we at AARP are definitely looking at. Older adults have disproportionately pre-existing conditions, heart and lung conditions, and we've seen things like extreme heat, that is something that definitely affects those with pre-existing conditions. And so, plastics is just another thing to kind of just keep, maybe not be too alarmed about, but at least to know about, right? And to be able to say, okay, how can I maybe limit my exposure, which is what we're going to get to in a couple minutes here. But before that, I wanted to turn back to Linda, because, another thing that we've been learning in our climate chat series is that, for a lot of folks, this is new, right? Environmental pollution is a very new thing because it's affecting just generally more and more of our population. But for other folks, for many folks in California, environmental pollution has been a way of life for decades. And so I wanted to turn to you, Linda. A disproportionate amount of environmental pollution inequitably affects, from freeways going through low-income neighborhoods to oil refineries being right in the backyards of minority communities. Just wanted to know, is this happening with microplastic pollutions as well?
You bet it is. And, of course, as I mentioned, and I think that's why I spent a bit of time introducing the connection with the petrochemical complex, because most of these facilities are sited, in the most impacted communities, both by income and also by demographics, and it tends to be either Black or brown communities who live in this right next to this sources of pollution. That's both, pollution in the air that makes everybody very sick, but it's also sort of pollution in the water, pollution in the soil from multiple sources. So it's not just one thing, but it's the freeways on top of the trucks, on top of just the vehicles, right on top of the ports. So you add plastics, which is, unlike maybe the argument of that we need to fuel our transportation, this is a bit of a luxury to be, impacting communities like that, with a product that it ends up being so toxic from cradle to grave. Because as I mentioned, we're refining raw materials that make plastics, which come from oil and gas and fossil fuels, the majority, and in addition to other, toxic additives. And then the facilities that process them are there. Also, then when you were talking about this broken recycling system, now that we can't ship it off to bury, poor people in East Asia or in China, right? Like Southeast Asia or in China, then now we are being buried ourselves in where those landfills are, or the incinerators are, or even the facilities trying to sort out this overwhelming amount of materials, or where these things are being stored because there's no capacity to handle these materials right now in California. Then all of this is in communities of color. And in addition, the workforce that is part of, the men and women in the front lines of dealing with all of our trash, again, are not well paid. Our community tends to be communities of color that are overrepresented in these very, very dangerous jobs, because they tend to be waste management jobs, tend to have very low labor standards. So, out of sight, out of mind doesn't mean that it's not affecting people, and is definitely affecting some people way more than others. And then you layer on top climate change, which is making everything worse, every problem in our society worse, and is going to be compounding that. Then we're talking about a disaster that we're, forcing the most vulnerable Californians to deal with, because we, want 3 pieces of packaging around, or, every time we get something from Amazon.
Yeah, thank you so much, Linda. This issue of equity is very much on our mind in AARP also. And it's occurred to us that, especially it's occurred to all of us when we went through this essential worker issue, and who really makes the world go round here in a pinch. Is there anything special that can be done, that we've developed techniques for people that work in these facilities, or people that live near a freeway, say, can put extra filters on their house that can deal with this microplastic issue?
Unfortunately, yes, there are some steps that people can try to guard, their houses with special filters. Of course, again, it's an income and access issue, right? There's not enough programs out there to pay for everything that people need to protect themselves. And the truth is that, these particles are so fine and so small that they will, penetrate most places, as Dr. Coffin mentioned. I mean, this stuff is now being, found in our deepest tissue and blood, and in our blood, right? So I think what we need to do, especially just like with fossil fuels in general, but especially with plastics, is cut the problem at the source. There's alternatives out there already in the market. I think that we've gotten used to the system that is absolutely broken. And on top of everything, we were being made both good and guilty because, how we use or our relationship with the blue bin, right? But at the end of the day, even if we're being the best recyclers in our home and we're reducing as much plastic as we can, from intake, we're still being flooded, right? I mean, COVID showed that. COVID showed that those of us who, had to order food from outside because we had, vulnerable people in our households are now buried under those thick plastic bags. So I think it's important to put out there policy solutions now that are comprehensive. We've taken small bites at the apple. There's different examples all over the country and around the world, of sort of some bold moves, but California is always at the forefront. So basically it's eliminate all the problematic and unnecessary plastic items from your own personal choices, and also from the entire system. Like producers have to do this because it doesn't matter what, consumers can recycle as much as possible. This stuff is not going to disappear. It's going to continue burying us, right? So we have to eliminate all the problematic and unnecessary plastic items, right? Especially like the polystyrene or the styrofoam, the stuff that cannot be recycled, it cannot be reprocessed in a sustainable way. You innovate to ensure that the plastics that we do need are reusable, recyclable, or compostable. We circulate that all the plastic items we use, we keep them in our economy, which is called circular economy, ideally locally. So we have the local jobs and the local economic benefits, but also we distribute equitably the burdens and benefits across our society so that not every, one community has all the facilities, right? And another one has, just is receiving the money for the clean parks, right? And we have to keep it out of our environment. But I think one of the key things in all of our policies is that we have to embed accountability. We can't continue this thing of like creating perverse incentives to make profit on trash that producers don't deal with. And then, taxes, our taxpayers and ratepayers are the ones who are carrying the burden aside from our health, right? And so I don't think, my grandma used to have this thing like she grew up in a farm and she always said, you can't leave the foxes guarding the hen houses, right? So the solutions have to definitely make producer responsible, but it has to be a system that is very, very highly accountable so that the actual solutions are not just greenwashing and that they actually mitigate for the damage that's already been done.
All right. Thanks so much. And thanks for shining a bright light on all of this. Dr. Coffin, this is a good discussion about the microplastics and where we are with this. Is the pollution actually getting worse in face of what we're able to do now? And from your research and scientific perspective, what are the ways in which we can limit our microplastic exposure, both as individuals as a society?
So the rate of plastic production is currently exponentially increasing. Over 90% of the plastic that we've created was in the last 10 years. And we're currently set to double the rate of plastic that we produce by the year 2030. To put that in context, we've, as a society, created approximately 8 gigatons of plastic, which is more than twice as much as the mass of all living animals on Earth. So this problem is not just going to go away. If we were to implement all possible solutions that we have available, including recycling, waste management, circularity, as well as political and technological solutions, we would only cut emissions by 79% over the next 20 years. So effectively, we would still be producing about the same that we're producing today. And it seems that in order to prevent plastic pollution from increasing, we need to phase out the production of new plastic. And that's not to say that we're banning all plastic. It's that we're stopping to create new plastic, digging oil out of the ground and making new plastic, and really need to focus on the circularity component that Linda was mentioning. And ways that we can limit our microplastics exposure as individuals include reducing the amount of plastic that we interact with on a daily basis. Every time you unscrew a lid of a plastic water bottle, you are creating on the order of 2,000 microplastics. Those are going to go into the air. They're going to fall into the bottle. You're going to be drinking them. When you heat plastics, it increases the generation of microplastics by orders of magnitude. So a recent study found by heating a baby bottle, you can create trillions of nanoplastics relative to just not heating it, only creates on the order of hundreds. So I would really avoid any type of microwavable plastic or microwavable food dish or trying to heat anything at all in plastic. So it's okay to still use it. It's honestly impossible to avoid it. We buy everything in plastic, whether you want to or not, but maybe put it in a glass or ceramic container if you're going to throw it in your microwave, for example. We also know that the clothing that we wear is constantly sloughing off fibers. So if you can wear a natural fiber clothing, you're going to be limiting your exposure to microplastics. And also buying used clothing reduces your personal microfiber footprint. The first 3 washes of any synthetic microfiber clothing is going to release about 90% of the microfibers of the lifetime of that clothing. And 3 uses is also the average number of uses that consumers use a single garment before it goes into a landfill or gets put back into a reuse market. So if we can continue to just reuse synthetics as long as we can and buy natural fibers, then we can reduce our exposure. Also, as a society, like Linda mentioned, we just need to be thinking more about circularity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Coffin. I mean, it's so overwhelming, at times to kind of think about, yeah, I just had a cup of coffee, right? And there's a plastic, top to that paper cup, and just thinking about all the times growing up, on microwave dinners and, what happened there. And it's just so ubiquitous, right? And how, especially it's kind of mind blowing to think about that so much was produced just in the last 20 years. We're actually getting a lot of great stuff in the chat. And if you haven't, been able to engage yet with your question, please feel free to drop that in the chat for the Q&A. We are starting to monitor that now as we get to the last question that we'll get to with Linda in a minute. But just really quickly going back to Dr. Coffin's side, because we just want to make sure we clarify this, but we have a great comment from Stephen who mentions that there are many different types of plastics, and was just wondering if you could be more specific about the kind of plastics that you're studying. And then if I could just add on to that, what are the general plastics that we start seeing? Is there like a most common plastic or several different most common plastics?
So the toxicity studies that I've mentioned have focused on the plastics that we use the most: polyethylene, polyethylene terephthalate, polystyrene, polyvinyl chloride, and a few others. We're not finding differences in toxicity between the polymers. It seems like the particles themselves are causing the toxicity, and the concern with plastic particles relative to natural particles is that plastic particles are typically biopersistent, meaning once we are exposed to them, our bodies cannot break them down, unlike other particles which we've evolved over millennia to deal with. These plastic particles can become lodged in our tissue and stay there for years, if not our lifetime. They can even be passed on to our next offspring, which is what we've recently found in humans. And so the plastic doesn't seem to make a difference in terms of the toxicity. At least that's the state of the science right now.
Got it. And then, of those 3 that you mentioned, like what are is that the stuff that we're seeing in water bottles and the microfiber in clothes, everything that you mentioned?
Absolutely. It's really the high production plastics that are fairly ubiquitous. In drinking water, we tend to see much more fibers than we see in other areas like the ocean. And this is due to the fiber's ability to pass through conventional water treatment techniques. They tend to be very small and long, and they just have a way of getting through relative to fragments, which is mostly what we see out in the environment. The breakdown of single-use plastics creates these fragment particles.
Got it. Well, thank you so much for clarifying that, because I think that was a really good. Thanks, Stephen, too, for chiming in the chat with that good clarifying question. So before we go to the rest of our questions, I want to ask the final panelist question to Linda. So you mentioned a couple things as far as steps that we could take as a society to limit the rise of microplastics, but just wanted to return back to you, Linda, to kind of get your thoughts of some examples of laws being passed or looking to be passed or practices being performed that are looking to limit microplastics in communities here in California and or elsewhere.
You bet. And I did promise that I would go back to that, and I'll start with the big one, because I think I've staked my my reputation and my name on the idea of this very comprehensive a plan. But as I'd mentioned, you know, in November there will be this ballot measure called the California Recycling and Plastic Pollution Reduction Act. And the gist of it is that it would direct the state to adopt regulations that would be the most comprehensive in the nation by requiring all single-use plastic packaging and foodware to be recyclable, reusable, refillable, or compostable by 2030. And it would also require a total of and this is the key part, so we can, you know, get to what Dr. Collins said of like, even if for as much as we can recycle, we're still going to be putting way more plastic out into the environment that anybody can deal with or anything can deal with. So this law is going to try, and this is why it's unique, it's going to come out after to reduce the amount of single-use plastic packaging and foodware sold in California by no less than 25% by 2030. And it will levy a new fee on producers of single-use plastic products to help fund the recycling, the waste reduction, the composting, and the litter cleanup, you know, across the entire watershed and ecosystem from inland to the ocean. At least 25% of the new revenues from this ballot initiative must benefit the communities that are bearing the brunt of our major sources of pollution, including all of these waste facilities that we have been speaking about. But it's also, you know, the way that, like I said, producers have to be responsible. They can't just be making profit by putting all these products out there. That is externalizing all of the costs to taxpayers, to cities. This is why a lot of cities, you know, they're already, city of LA, LA County, for example, are also leading the charge, because they have not only endorsed the initiative, but they're actually passing their own bans of this single-use packaging and single-use foodware, because it's so costly now for the cities and for the counties to manage. Is just making it completely unsustainable in terms of economics for the city. So that's affecting taxpayers and ratepayers. I think producers have to be responsible. But one key thing also is it also prohibits the state to count chemical recycling or something known as advanced recycling as actually recycling, because that's the new frontier that the chemistry, you know, the petrochemical industry is now putting their money into by saying, hey, you know what, you can throw as much styrofoam into the trash, because then we're just going to collect it all and break it down into, you know, molecules and then put it back together again into raw plastics. Well, all of that is releases, and it is a very toxic process that requires also a lot of energy. So that is one of those terrible solutions that are used for greenwashing, what is really, you know, a scheme to increase profit margins. So I think that is one of the most promising policies. But, you know, there's tons of examples. You know, we've done the plastic bag ban. We did the straws and utensils upon request, the extended producer responsibilities on mattresses. You know, we get the bottle buyback. We try and, you know, we have been trying for years to do statewide legislation, but it's, you know, again, it's hard to give the keys of the henhouse to the fox. So it's important to keep pushing, you know, this drumbeat locally, because local governments, you know, they can't just afford to handle this anymore. But we also need to create, you know, a comprehensive framework so that we can build a sustainable system for how to deal with our materials, especially, you know, the plastics that we're still going to end up having to deal with in the system.
Yeah, thank you so much, Linda, for that. So I want to now get to our questions. One that's popped up here in the chat box, and thanks everybody for sending in your questions. And please feel free, we'll be taking questions from now until a couple minutes before 1 o'clock. But I really like a couple folks mentioning, okay, what are alternatives to plastic, right? I mean, there's a couple, I like the one, I want to hear more about this mushroom-based one. That's really interesting. But obviously, we've had many alternatives to plastics that we use as a society, over the many centuries. But wondering if there's other things that are popping up on the market. Dr. Coffin or Linda, do you have any thoughts on alternatives like that?
Well, that's thankfully, I mean, that's what California is also known for pushing innovation, and new technologies. I mean, all over the world is, it's not just here, but it's alternative are popping all over the world. I was just thinking in Panama, and, they depend on their rainforest and our healthy ecosystems so much, they're trying some strong policies on plastics. And I saw this, straws made out of, coconut byproducts. So, this stuff is possible. It's out there. It just needs to be built as, economy of scale, right? But they need to be allowed to get into the market, right? Right now, the way we are subsidizing these fossil fuel plastics, it's making it very hard for those products to be competitive. So we need to even the playing field, So right now, by design, most plastic products cannot be recycled. In the United States the recycling rate in the country has never broken 9%, So most of this ends up being buried in landfills and burned or carried by the ocean, right? And as microplastics, as we've heard. So, we need to be able to push industry towards, exploring and expanding those solutions that are already out there. And that's why the initiative is going to try to put money in there. And, I saw a comment about the plastic bags, and I just wanted to mention, we learned a lot about the plastic bag ban in California. And I think all over the world, those who have been trying it in different ways have learned a lot. But one of the key things that we learned is that you have to put up front a reduction in plastics altogether, because otherwise you're going to end up with a loophole and they're going to end up selling you thicker plastics. And now we are ending up with bigger plastics that, yeah, I reuse those bags, but I don't reuse them 100 times, right? So now we're ended up with a bigger plastic problem.
Yeah, great point. Dr. Coffin, did you want to chime in on any alternatives? Have you heard about this mushroom-based one or any other type of, or coconut-based or what have you? Any alternatives that have come across your radar?
Yeah, there's been a lot of really exciting innovations in the alternative space. And one of the things that I think we need to remember is that plastic is new. We've been carrying on for millennia as society without it and doing just fine. The milkman or milk person that used to come and deliver it to your home, whatever happened to that? I mean, that seems like a something that we could easily implement, and I'm seeing communities easily implement that. There is a zero waste initiative that's happened in city of Berkeley, and a lot of the restaurants there are providing reusable food packaging. When you go to the restaurant, you pay a little bit of a deposit, you wash it, you bring it back. They have their own washing machine to sanitize it, and then they just continue the cycle. And consumers will actually pay more to have this packaging because they value the aesthetics. The presentation of food on a metal plate or a paper plate is just more satisfying than on polystyrene, for example. And also that their personal exposure to microplastics is much lower. I think that there's so much room for creativity in this space and innovation, and we can address the climate crisis and the plastic crisis together by innovating these materials. I recently learned about a mineral-based plastic, which could replace some certain single-use plastics that we deem to be essential to society. The mineral that they use is calcium carbonate. When that enters the terrestrial environment, which most of our plastic that makes it into the waste stream does, it actually increases the pH of the soil, and this is good for plants. Talk to a farmer. Increasing the pH is something that they're typically trying to do. And there are other innovations such as using tree waste, which would otherwise emit greenhouse gas emissions, and creating durable plastics like in cars or something that you use for a very long time. And you're actually pulling the carbon out of the atmosphere and preventing it from going back into the atmosphere. Otherwise, the tree waste, if we burn it, you're just putting it right back. And so there's a lot of, I think, potential opportunities if innovators are allowed to compete in this space that currently, like Linda mentioned, is we're subsidizing the petroleum industry. And so if we just take our hand off of the lever and let the free economy solve the problem, they might actually have a chance to break through.
I like that, using capitalism for good here. So I just wanted to turn it over to Bob and see, I know that we're both kind of monitoring the Q&A, but Bob, anything coming up for you as a good question for our panelists?
I see a spattering of references to the COVID environment and the impact that is having. We all see masks discarded now, or just blown out of cars or something as the vehicle went down the highway. Is there any special thing that we're doing to make sure that the discards from this are recyclable in any way?
Sadly, Bob, no. This is why we need to get this initiative through. Even though this initiative came up before COVID, I think this past 2 years have only just made it more urgent because it's now gotten worse. We're now getting more food delivered, we're more bags, more masks. So I think it's, aside from the policy things, I think as people, as human beings, as consumers, as voters, and I know that the AARP family is super solid in all those things. We have to educate ourselves, right? Being here is important. Empower ourselves to, be able to, as consumers, say to producers, to vendors, to retailers, I don't want this plastic. I wish you sold less plastic. I wish my stuff came wrapped in less pieces of plastic, And also that, we really become a lot more conscious that it's just throwing it in the blue bin is not the solution at this point. I think the solution is really reducing it at the source and making sure that better alternatives, fill in the gaps where we really, need plastics, right? Because we're still going to need it, right? We're still going to need a lot. I mean, we're still going to have this on the go life, and, we are going to need it. But we also need to shift and maybe go back to somewhat the old ways where we didn't have all this plastic available and the sky didn't fall and we didn't all get sick, right? I mean, despite all this plastics in our system, the single-use stuff that is supposed to be healthier, we still had a crazy global pandemic, right? So that's kind of another lie. So I think we all need to be a little bit more responsible for our consumption, for whom we vote for, what leaders are out there and pushing for what solutions, really. And at the end of the day, really thinking about this in terms of not just the polar bears, not just the turtles, not just sort of the how pretty the streets or the beaches or the rivers look, but really ultimately our health, and our well-being and our quality of life.
Yeah, no, that's really well said. And honestly, I just wanted to call back something that you mentioned, Linda, earlier on, which is to be kinder to ourselves, right? I mean, I think, one thing I just realized, I have this otherwise metal bottle, but what's the top made of? It's plastic, right? And of course, I don't, for several years haven't been buying reusable water bottles anymore and trying to drink everything out of this guy, but it's still a piece of plastic. And I think that we all need to be kinder and to realize that because it is so ubiquitous in our lives, just if there's at least one action that you could take a day, that is going to make a huge impact. And maybe you add 2 more actions or whatnot as you kind of go by. It's just a change of behavior, right? And to really, as you mentioned, Linda, there are much more, there are bigger fish to fry, right? There are more, these companies that need to be held more accountable than just, everyday people, right? Because we're part of the system. And I just wanted to really quickly, Linda, just because we have had some questions in the chat, can you just really quickly, maybe a minute or less, kind of summarize the initiative in terms of, like, you're seeking to ban all plastics, right? It's more of just like a cent increase. I just wanted to give you that quick minute to just clarify what are the actual specifics of the initiative.
Well, there is a ban on polystyrene, on foam plastics.
An example
right,
of that are
the styrofoam cups.
styrofoam
right?
cups.
The
Okay.
styrofoam cups, which has always been the most problematic of all the plastics because it's so light, it flies everywhere, it breaks down very easily, it's completely unrecyclable. And right now, the only way theoretically that they can recycle is by this chemical recycling, which is terrible for the environment, right?
We're not talking about a total ban of like water bottles or.
No. It's prompting industry to reduce by 25% the amount of plastic they put out there. How they do that is going to be up to industry, right? How they what they prioritize in terms of where they're going to actually use the plastic. And really 25% is not 100%, is not 50%, right? It's only 25%. So we're hoping that this is going to, shift. It's not going to completely fix all of our plastic problems in California, but I think it's going to allow us to shift into this new, more sustainable, packaging future that circular economy that we're trying to develop. So no, but we're all still going to be seeing, I'm sure lots of plastics, but hopefully it's going to be a reversal that, like most recently I bought, I love sweets, and I bought this box of Rice Krispie treats, and I'm like, oh, there's chocolate and strawberry and vanilla, and they're like squares. There's 64 little packages with tiny 1-inch, wide pieces of this in this box, and I figured like this is so unnecessary, I mean, really, like I can have some self-control and not eat, 2 gigantic bars of crisp, but I don't need them to package every little, ounce into this plastics that will never, it's like those foil plastics that cannot be recycled. And that's the problem. You can't keep on putting out their materials that we can't deal with at the end of their life cycle.
Great points. And Bob, did you have one more question maybe for the panelists to round us out?
Yeah, there were a couple of questions about how this gets into the ocean. And I know that you mentioned that it's airborne. But one of the quickies on the TV I saw recently was several communities have banned Mylar balloons. And you would think that's not a problem, but they actually had an example of a team going up and down the beach picking up particles, and they filled up a 5-gallon jar with pieces of Mylar balloons. Are these harmful plastics also? And are communities making any progress themselves on banning the really obnoxious particle plastic issues they have?
Do you want to go, Linda?
Well, I just, industry has very powerful lobbyists that will keep, those balloons in the system unless there's some political courage to ban them statewide, Otherwise, yeah, we'll have to leave it up to local jurisdictions that have to pay the price for the damages to these, especially the electrical systems that these things cause. Outside of then when they deflate, they end up living forever and ever, in the stomach of a bird. Sorry, Dr. Collin, go ahead.
So in the US, we have typically pretty good waste management. Only 0.5% of plastic actually makes it out into the environment, compared to some countries in other parts of the world where it's upwards of 60% of the plastic leaks into the environment. That's not to say that the US has no role in this, though, because we send a vast majority of plastic to those countries that have virtually no waste management. And so in a way, we are making this plastic readily available. A recent estimate found that the US is actually the number 3rd country responsible for plastic pollution when you take into account all the plastic that we send to across the world.
Well, I hate to end on that note, but we are at time, and I think that it bears repeating that, definitely let's be kind to ourselves in the sense that this is something that, even though this is a relatively new thing in human history, right? Plastic use, as Dr. Coffin was saying, just for better or worse, it's become something so ubiquitous and common in our lives, and it's still going to take a while for us to, extricate from ourselves and our behaviors, but it's worth trying, right? And in whatever ways that we can, either individually at our homes or with a vote potentially. So I hope that today's conversation has been educational. Again, we're just so excited to have this event series and to have Linda and Dr. Coffin join us today. And many thanks to our moderator, Bob Pratt, for joining me as an AARP volunteer, an AARP member, and also behind the scenes to Shay McCaslin, who is our event producer. But thank you again so much for joining us. You can find this recorded on our AARP Climate Chats event page. You could just search AARP Climate Chats. And there's also just a quick plug, but we did do a very special Climate Chats actually just a couple weeks ago on composting and recycling. So a lot of the questions that I've been seeing here, you can definitely look at that recording and might get some of your answers there. But thank you again so much for joining. We really appreciate all of you being on here, and we hope